10 through 18. Okay, please rise for the reading of the Bible. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you come to Zoar. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. And the Lord said to Abram, after which Lot was separated from him, lift up now your eyes, and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, and eastward and westward. And I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then will your seed also be numbered. Together, then Abram removed his tent and came and dwelled in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and built there an altar to the Lord. Amen. You may be seated. Okay. So last time we were talking about how there is only one great inheritance. There's only one great inheritance, and that inheritance is God's quote-unquote dwelling with presence. So next slide. Dwelling with or dwelling among presence. That's what we're talking about. This is also known as God's temple presence, or God's parousia, or God's parousia presence. And parousia is just Greek for presence. All these terms just mean there's a goal, there's an end, there's a telos, there's a destination for the things that God points to since Adam. And it is God's permanent dwelling with or dwelling among presence that all the authors of the Bible are pointing to. So if people were to ask, a lot of times we sort of only focus on the salvation aspect of it, and we don't get to see the big picture. But if you actually take a look at what the New Testament writers are saying, their view is constantly on the return of Jesus Christ, whereas the Old Testament is constantly on the arrival of the Messiah. And that's because there's a two arrival of the Messiah, the first coming and the second coming. In the first coming, he dies and resurrects, and then the second coming, he comes back as judge. So you have Lot, along with Abram, who was actually a convert from their idol-worshiping ways towards the true God. So they used to be idol worshippers, then they converted from idol worshiping to God. They're converts. And the issue here is when God makes a covenant with converts, such as Abram and Lot, the scope of the covenant that God makes, so the breadth of it, or you could say like the umbrella, what fits into God's covenant, always includes the children of the converts as well. So when God makes a covenant, it always includes the children and their children's children and so on. And we don't have time to get into details at this point, but that's the whole point of God's inheritance. So God's inheritance isn't just you get it, it's you and your children and your children's children, your family has it. That's the point. Every covenant or federal head is meant to share their inheritance from God with the group that they are heads or covenant or federal heads over. And this is why roles matter. Despite sinners insisting on egalitarianism and this blurring of the roles between men and women, the role of the federal head, so in God's economy, the covenant or the federal head is the funnel through which God dispenses his covenant blessings. So God funnels his covenant blessings through the covenant head. Without the covenant head, there's no blessing. So here's 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 3. But I would have you know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Okay, so you can see the funnel there, right? So first, God blesses. So a next arrow. So one at a time. Not all three, one at a time. Yeah, so first God funnels his blessing through Christ. Because the head of Christ is God. Does that make sense? And then every man, the head of every man is Christ. So that funnel being given to Christ, now that's funneled to his brethren. Or you could say whatever family unit or whatever group unit their head's over. It's the federal or covenant head. And the head of the woman is the man. So Christ's blessing that it should receive from God, that gets funneled into the brethren who are the head of their family or local church or their community or whatever it is. And that's the way blessings work. That's the way covenant inheritance blessings work. It's funneled downwards, or it's funneled through the covenant heads. So every Christian receives God's covenant blessing through Christ. That's true. So whether you're a woman or a man, every covenant blessing in Christ we directly receive as individuals. And that's because Christ is the head of the whole race of the Christian brotherhood. So Jesus Christ is the head or the federal head or the covenant head of the entire Christian brotherhood. However, in each localized ethnicity of that race, which we call the family unit or a church unit or some sort of a whatever covenant unit that makes up this localized covenant community, the head is the father figure, the patriarch, through which the particular portion of God's blessing is funneled into that particular family brotherhood. So when a man or a woman marries and they start a new nuclear family, the husband becomes the head of that new nuclear family unit once they leave their parents. And this order is the mechanism by which God blesses both Christians and non-Christians in his common grace. So the way this works is not only specific to Christians, but, because this is a special grace, but we're talking about common grace also. In common grace, the way God's common blessing through his common grace flows through each family unit is through that covenant head. That's the mechanism. So if you were to sort of like boil everything down and sort of like get at what's going on here, the reason why the world is in such a mess as it is because there are men, there are women, children, agencies, institutions, governments, religions, groups that actively destroy this funneling system. First through anti-theism and then through envy and covetousness. So this system is destroyed by anti-theism, by the rejection of things that is God. And then, once that's accomplished, through envy and covetousness, desiring other people's things. Envy and covetousness is at the root of all destructive isms that flow out from anti-theism. So some of you might be saying, Brother Tom, speak English so we can understand it. Okay. The setup here is like a goose that lays the golden egg once a year. You guys know about that Aesop's fable? The goose that lays the golden egg once a year? The covenant head, which is the patriarch figure in whatever localized group it is the image of the son. That covenant head in the localized group is the one that God chose to funnel his blessings or chose to funnel all his eggs through. Does that make sense? Those that will destroy this mechanism of God's blessing will tell you, if you destroy the goose, you can get all the eggs that the goose has all at once, and not once a year. Does that make sense? You can have all that you want if you destroy this covenant figure. So what happens when you kill the goose? Do you get all the eggs that the goose would have laid? Or do you lose all the future blessing that you would have gotten? You lose all the future eggs. And this is the reason God holds all individuals responsible for their individual faults and sins. But when it comes to groups, when it comes to covenant groups, God will always blame the man. He will always blame the man. Because the man is the covenant head responsible for that particular unit. And it's for this reason that men must have an unshakable understanding of God's holiness, righteousness, and goodness. It's for that reason. Or another way to say this is the reason why men must have a deep and rooted grasp of the weight of God's covenant blessing, so that none under their care lose their blessing. That's the point. Does that make sense? Does this graph now make sense? And then does that verse now make more sense? And that was Lot's issue. Lot was a convert just like Abram, so that he would at least partake in the salvation which would have come through the Messiah as part of Abram's covenant blessing. So Lot would take part in that. But because Lot did not understand the weight of God's covenant blessing, he forfeited his children's portion of that Abram's blessing. So he received a portion of it, but he forfeited his children's portion of it. As the covenant head of his family, he forfeited his children's portion. How do we know Lot did not grasp or understand the weight of God's covenant blessing, whereas Abram did? How do we know that? Well, Abram stayed in the land of Canaan because Abram understood the covenant blessing and God's temple presence to be the one and the same inheritance for God, or from God. So Abram understood that the covenant blessing and the temple presence is the one and same inheritance that God is giving to Abram. He understood that. Canaan being a metaphor for that temple and a metaphor for that Messiah through which God's going to give his blessing and inheritance. Does that make sense? So Abram understood that this is a metaphor. If you're in Canaan, you receive all the blessings. If you're outside of Canaan, you receive none of the blessings. That's what Abram understood. Lot did not understand this. So he left the promised temple presence of God for a measly grass and water area for the sake of his wealth, for the sake of his flock and his cattle and his material wealth. Lot followed Abram out of Ur in order to share with Abram's blessing in God's covenant. Right? That's why Lot followed Abram out. Otherwise, he would have stayed with the rest of the other family members. But Lot mistakenly thought that God's blessing was material, rather than first being spiritual and as a residue or an anticipation of that spiritual blessing, the material. So Lot prioritized thinking, this is what God's blessing is about, is this material wealth that I have, and not there's a far greater inheritance that these things are just shadows of, which is God's temple presence. And he wasn't able to recognize and understand that, which is why, though he earned a portion of it, or not earned, though he received a portion of Abram's blessing in his salvation, it was not passed on to his children. He forfeited, as a covenant head, he forfeited his children's covenant blessing. So this is Genesis 13:10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw the plain of Jordan, and that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you come to Zoar. So it's just describing how very grassy it is, because there's plenty of water, there's plenty of food for the livestock. Everything's growing there. The author, or the editor of Genesis, mentions both the Eden garden. Do you see that? Where it says, even as the garden of the Lord. So it's mentioning the Garden of Eden here. And it mentions Egypt. It mentions both. And the Sodom and Gomorrah, which will later be destroyed. So both are being mentioned. So the editor or the author is looking back after it has already happened. So what was Eden? Eden was God's temple. Do you guys remember that? Eden was God's temple. What was the Garden of Eden? It was God's sanctuary within the Temple of Eden. So Eden is the temple, and the sanctuary is the meeting place where God would commune with Adam and Eve. So if that's the Garden of Eden, what's Egypt? What's Egypt? Egypt is the exile from Canaan, from which Israel would later come back into Canaan from. Right? So Egypt is an exile place. It's a place where you're going outside of God's covenant blessing. It's an exile place. So there's a contrast here between Eden, which is the temple of God, with God's temple presence, in which God communes with Adam and Eve. And then there's the exile place, where you have to come back from that in order to participate or partake in God's temple presence. That's what's being mentioned here. Therefore, since Sodom is being compared to Egypt, right here, right? It was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So that means Sodom and Gomorrah was well watered before it was destroyed, like the land of Egypt. So Sodom and Egypt is being compared here. Does that make sense? It's being compared. And therefore, Sodom is a place of exile. That's the point that this author is making. Sodom is a place of exile. And it's toward Jordan, or actually it's beyond Jordan or around the Jordan area. And that Jordan area is actually outside of Canaan. So that's the point that the author's trying to make here is they're trying to set up why Lot lost his covenant blessing. So he took share in it, but why he lost it for the rest of his family, why he lost it for the rest of his family, whereas Abram not only received it for himself, but was also able to pass it down to his children and his children's children. What's the difference here? That's what the author is setting up here, and has to do with how we understand God's temple presence and the inheritance to which it relates to God's temple presence. So here's Genesis chapter 13, verses 11 and 12. Oh yeah, so do you guys understand that Sodom is a place like Egypt? It's an exile place. And therefore Canaan is like Eden. Canaan is like Eden, where it has the temple presence of God. That's the point that's being made here. So here's Genesis 13, 11 and 12. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. And they separated themselves the one from the other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, but Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. Okay, so the author, because he already has in his mind the exodus out of Egypt, because he's looking back, this description of Lot pitching his tent towards Sodom is a setup that's contrasting the pitching of God's tabernacle tent towards the east. So whoever the author or the editor is, they already know what's happened here, and they already know about the tabernacle within the wilderness. And they're making a point here about which way the tent is pitched, because that tells you where their heart is directed towards. So here's Genesis chapter 3, 24. So this is Eden. How do we know Eden was a temple? So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the garden of Eden cherubims. So where's the entrance to Eden? What direction? East. So they're exiled which direction? If the entrance is at the east, they're exiled towards? They're kicked out towards? I mean, if the entrance is at the east, that means that where's the direction they're being kicked out from, or kicked out towards? Yeah, they're being kicked out towards east because that's where the entrance is. So if they're going to return back, which way do they have to move? They have to come back west to come back to the presence of God. Does that make sense? Because the gate is on the east. So they've been kicked out towards the east. And then for them to return, God has to bring them back from the west, towards the west, or from the east towards the west. From the east towards the west is God's presence. From the west towards the east is away from God's presence. That's the point that Genesis is making. So here's Genesis 4:6. Just to make sure we understand what God is talking about here through his prophets, or through the authors and the editors. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelled in the land of Nod. Where? East of Eden. So is that closer to or away from God's presence? Because it's towards east. That means it's away, right? Away from God's presence. Because closer would be westward. Yeah, so Cain went eastward. If he were to pitch a tent, which direction? In other words, if Cain is entering his tent, which way would Cain be entering his tent? Would it be entering eastwards or would it be entering westwards if Cain was to enter a tent? Remember, west is towards God, east is away from God. So if Cain was to make a tent, and he's like, this is where I'm going to live, which direction would Cain be entering into his tent? Westward towards God or eastward away from God? So you would think Cain would be going towards God when he enters his tent? No, because there's a point being made here. It's too consistent. It's like the word west doesn't show up until like way later for like entering somewhere. So in other words, like Cain's entrance for if he had a tent, which he does, Cain's entrance would be on the west, and he would be entering from the west to the east because he's pitched his tent away from God. Because he wants to live away from God. Does that make sense? He wants to live away from God, so that's where he pitched his tent. So for the Garden of Eden, the gate is on the east side. Let me see. So the gate is on the east side, right? So when Adam and Eve were being exiled, they have to go this way, right? And then Cain moved from here to here. So the question is, if he's going to build a tent, which direction would the entrance of his tent be? Well, the entrance would be on the west so that he can move east into his tent. Why? Because he wants to live close to God or far away from God? Far away. So he'd be moving into his tent this way. And then if he has to move, which direction would he move? This way. And then if he were to, after he moved, if he were to make another tent, which direction do you think would he pitch his tent? Towards the east, right? Entrance on the west side so they can go in and say, I don't want to live close to God, I want to live away from God. Does that make sense? That's the Genesis imagery that's being created here. And that's very significant for us because of Lot. And just to make sure I'm not making this up, here's the vision of God's temple that Ezekiel has. So God's saying, I'm going to build a temple. And where is the entrance? Or where is it pitched? Where is this temple pitched towards? Or you could say, where's the gate? Afterward, he brought me to the gate. So we're talking about the gate of the temple. And even the gate which way is the gate of the temple of God that God wants to make? Where is that located? Towards the east. So that means if you want to come into the temple, which way are you coming in? From the east to west. That means you're going towards God. And this is the direct reference back to Genesis where if Adam and Eve were to come back to Eden, they have to travel west. Does that make sense? Okay. And this is also how we know the tabernacle that Moses had during his time had the entrance facing the east. In order that for people to come into the tabernacle, they'd have to go westward. So westward movement is moving towards God. Eastward is moving away from God. So if you pitch your tent towards the east, that means you're entering into your tent away from God. You want to live away from God is the point. Whereas if you pitch your tent towards the west, that means you want to live nearer to God. Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's the first point. And the other point is about Jordan. How do we know Jordan is outside of the land of Canaan? So here's Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 27. Get yourself this talk. So Moses took the burden of Israel's sin, and God blamed Moses for the sins of Israel. So Moses is not able to enter into the land of Canaan. And so this is what God tells. So Moses goes, Lord, can't I enter in? And God says, you can't. But I'll tell you what, I'll let you at least look at it. I'll let you at least look at the land of Canaan, but you can't go in. So God says, get yourself up into the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward and behold it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan, which is past the Jordan River. So it's just a picture of like Moses longingly looking at the land of Canaan and being in exile. That's the point. Moses is in exile. Okay, so Lot pitched his tent. Can we go back to Genesis chapter 13, verse 11 and 12? Let's see which direction Lot pitched his tent. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent towards Sodom. That means as he's entering, the entrance faces it the opposite way because he's entering into his tent pitched towards Sodom. So where's the if Lot is moving east, where is it? In verse 10, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord. There it is. Then Lot chose him all the plains of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. Right? And he pitched his tent toward Jordan. Where is the entrance located? If he's going into his tent towards east, where is the entrance located? West. So the question is, okay, is Lot then, when he wants to live somewhere, is he trying to live closer to God or is he trying to live away from God? Away, because he's facing his tent towards the east, towards Sodom and Gomorrah. Does that make sense? That's where his heart is. That's the point. That's where he wants to live. Not in the covenant land despite the famine, but where there's health and wealth, away from God's presence. And the Deuteronomy 3, verse 27, that slide, brings up 2 points. Moses cannot cross back from the Jordan River, which means he has to stay in exile. That's the point, because Jordan is outside of Canaan. That's why Moses is exiled, because Jordan is outside of Canaan. Where did Lot go? Towards The plains of Jordan. That means he's exiling himself out, just like Cain. And so this means that the other side of the Jordan, which is where Lot went, to the plains of Jordan, is a place of exile. That's the point. He's exiling himself away from God's presence, despite coming into Canaan with Abram, because God had promised Abram and those from Abram's family who are willing to come into Canaan have an inheritance for you. That's the reason why Abram, Sarah, and Lot moved in the first place, is to receive God's inheritance. That's the first point. Only an idiot. The first point is only an idiot would self-exile himself away from God's presence for the things, the pleasures of this world or whatever it is, like Cain. But the second point, and the second point we want to recognize here is the description here. Lift up your eyes westward, northward, southward, eastward. This is the same language used for Abram. Right? When God says, go up on a hill and then take a look around. This is Genesis chapter 13, verse 16, I think. 13, verse 16. Oh, sorry, 14. And the Lord said to him, after which Lot was separated from him, look to the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. It's the same language. Does that make sense? So why did God use this language? Not all times, but very often, when you have these descriptions of the four corners of the earth or the four cardinal directions, or when it's explicitly spelled out north, south, east, and west, we're talking about the presence of God or the temple presence of God or the temple itself in the Bible. Not all the times, but very often. Very, very often. It's describing a temple setting. So here's 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 25. So the washing basin for the Solomon's temple stood upon 12 oxen, 3 oxen looking towards the north, 3 looking towards the west, 3 looking towards the south, and 3 looking towards the east. And the sea, which is in the water basin, the water in the water basin, was set above them, and all their their hind legs were inward, meaning the oxen were facing out. So this basin is describing the thing that the priest has to wash before they go inside the temple, and it's a temple setting, but it specifically describes this northward, eastward, southward, westward description here. Here's 1 Chronicles 9:24. In 4 quarters, or the 4 gatekeepers of the temple, in 4 quarters were the porters or gatekeepers toward the east, west, north, and south. So again, temple description of where these gatekeepers are. They're to the north, to the east, to the south, to the west. Here's the vision of Ezekiel, God's temple vision. As for so this is before Ezekiel has the temple vision on earth, he gets a glimpse of heaven. And what ends up happening is, as his eyes are moving towards the glory of God in his vision, he can't describe what that glory is like, so it becomes very, very vague. So at first he's like, they look like, eagles and head of angels, and then it kind of looks like this, and then it kind of looks like this thing, because he can't describe what God's glory is. Because no eye has seen or ear has heard like what that's like. So he's trying to describe these things here. As for the likeness of their faces, he's talking about the angels that hold up God's throne like a chariot. He's talking about the 4 beasts, or the 4 angel-like beings. As for the likeness of their faces, the 4 angels, had the face of a man and the face of a lion on the right side, and they 4 had the face of an ox on the left side. They 4 also had the face of an eagle. So there's 4 faces, and they're facing cardinal directions, left, right, back, and forward, north, south, east, and west. And when they went upon their 4 sides, okay, and they didn't turn when they went, but to the place which they had looked, they followed it. They turned not as they went. So they're permanently fixed in a north, south, east, west direction, and they don't turn as they're moving God's throne around. They just move this way, and up and down. So it's describing these 4. It's a heavenly temple setting that's being described here is the point. This north, south, east, west language. Is this making sense so far? Okay. So yeah, that's what we're describing here. And that's the language that God used towards Abram when he said, measure the land out, walk the breadth and the length of it. He said, take a look, north, south, east, west. So using temple language is the point. The author is making sure we understand God is using temple language here. So God had angels that held up his throne like a chariot, and they didn't move. They only moved in these four cardinal directions, or without turning. They moved, without turning, and they're constantly facing these four cardinal directions. And this is because why? Well, the question is like, why is the heavenly places described in this way, and why is the earthly temple described in this way? That's because the earthly tabernacles and temples are visible representations of what's going on in heaven. So when you see a tabernacle, there's the presence of God, right? And then inside that temple is a representation of what heaven would be like. It's a representation because we wouldn't be able to understand unless we see with our new bodies. And then you add to that, so you add to this cardinal direction temple language, you add to that temple language, God telling Abram to walk or measure the length and breadth of the land. So this is Genesis 13, 16, 17, and 18. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and the breadth of it, for I will give it to you. So we're not really, when we normally read this, we just sort of like read past it. But this is temple language when something is being measured. So Abram is not just, God's not telling Abram, just walk through it. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, measure it. I want you to measure the breadth and the length of it. Does that make sense? If God's only talking about walking, there's no need to measure, and there's no need to point out measurements here. But the fact that God is pointing out measurements, meaning he wants Abram to measure it by walking around. So this idea of measuring the length and the breadth of something, it's not only a word search, but if we don't have time for like everything. So if you just do a cursory word search about length and breadth, and then you see what kind of language pops up, not always, but very, very, very often, it's temple language. So here's Genesis chapter 6:15. And this is the fashion, it's talking to Noah, fashion which you shall make of it. The length of the ark will be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. So what's the Ark of the Covenant? It's being measured like the Ark of the Covenant is being measured like God's presence is in the ark, so what must it be? If God's presence is in the ark, it must be. There's no other term for this because God's presence is inside the ark. And God actually says, come in. And then he goes, go out. Huh? Temple, yeah, it has to be temple. Has to be. Right? Because God's presence is in, his temple presence is in the ark. And we see this measuring language within the temple. That's the point. There's a measuring language, this length and breadth of it. Remember, this is cursory. So there's like instances in the Bible where the word length, breadth, these measurements don't appear, but measurement is actually occurring. But we don't have time for that. So here's Exodus 25. So we're talking about the actual, the Ark of the Covenant now. And they shall make the ark of shittim wood, 2 cubits and half shall be the length of it, and 1.5 cubits the breadth thereof, and 1.5 cubits the height thereof. Do you guys know what the Ark of the Covenant is? Who does not know what an Ark of the Covenant is? Okay, so what's inside the Ark of the Covenant? Where God said, don't even touch it because it's so holy. Yeah, but the tablets themselves aren't what's making it holy. Right? Moses touched the tablets, nothing happened to him. But if Moses touched the Ark of the Covenant, he would die immediately. Why? What's contained inside the Ark of the Covenant that makes it so holy that if you touch it, you die immediately? There's only one thing in the world that can do that. Whereas if you just touch it, you immediately die. There's only one thing in the entire universe, in the God's, his spirit or temple presence. That's what's inside the ark. And it's being described as the length and the cube and the breadth. Does that make sense? So that makes an ark a miniature representation of what a temple is. Does that make sense? It's a miniature representation. Here's Exodus 39:9. So this is the breastplate that the high priest has to wear. Okay? It was 4 square. They made the breastplate doubled, meaning it's double lined. A span was the length thereof, and a span the breadth thereof being doubled. So it was a square is all it's saying, right? And it's double layered because inside of it, there's these two stones that's put in there called the Urim and the Thurim. And the will of God was determined by a high priest asking God, okay, should Israel go out and fight or should we not fight? And then they would reach in, and only the high priest can reach in, and then take a stone out. If the stone is like a white or whatever color it was, that means go and do it. And if it was the other color, the Thummim, it'd be don't do it. Does that make sense? The will of God was present inside that breastplate. And therefore the presence of God. The temple presence of God, where the will of God exists, is in that breastplate. So it's being measured here, length and the breadth thereof. Now these are the things which Solomon was instructed. So this is the actual Solomon's temple we're talking about now. The length by cubits after the first measures, 600 cubits, and the breadth, 200 cubits. So the point is, when we're talking about cardinal directions, plus we're talking about the length or the measurement of something, we're definitely, it's like 100%, 110% we're talking about temple here. Does that make sense? In other words, God is telling Abram where God wants to dwell. That's what's going on. And where does God want to dwell and with who? Where does God want to dwell? And with who does God want to dwell with? Well, where did Abram come from into? He came from Ur into Canaan. Abram came into Canaan. So where is God saying he's going to dwell? In Canaan. He's saying his temple presence will exist in Canaan. That's what he's letting Abram know. Not only Abram, but Lot as well. Lot knew this too. That's why they followed him out, because God promised them an inheritance. Abram understood God's temple presence was the inheritance. So Abram understood that, which is why after the Egypt episode, he came back into the land of Canaan and never left again. In fact, later we're going to learn this. When he wants to get a wife for his son, he doesn't even let his son leave the land of Canaan. He sends his servant outside of Canaan and say, find a wife for my son here, so that he doesn't marry the Canaanites and the other idol worshippers here. And because Abram understood this, not only himself, but his children will receive this inheritance of God's presence, or we could say salvation now here. Whereas Lot, as the covenant head of his family, forfeited his children's birthright, or his children's covenant blessing. Does that make sense? And this is just like a small, not a trailer, like an anticipation of what's going on. Now that we understand, because a lot of times many people miss, so I'm pretty sure not a lot of people hear sermons about Lot forfeiting his inheritance for his children. Not many people talk about that, but if you understand what's going on there, then Ruth makes a lot of sense. Ruth makes a lot of sense. Lot lost it because he separated himself from that funnel, which is Abram, right? From that land, which is Canaan. And then what happens to Ruth? I mean, if you guys don't know Ruth, Ruth is like Lot's like great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. And she becomes an Israelite and David's grandmom by coming into the land of Canaan and joining herself to the tribe of Judah through Boaz. So by joining herself to the tribe of Judah through Boaz, through marriage, she not only receives eternal salvation, but in the eternal salvation in Israel, but it's okay. She not only receives eternal salvation, but she becomes the grandmom to David, who then, as you know, becomes a lineage to Jesus Christ, who then is able to share the salvation of God to the rest of the world. Does that make sense? So if you understand Lot, then you can understand Ruth is sort of like what do you call it? God, by God's grace, he's reversing the inheritance that Lot lost for his children. And she gains it back towards, what Lot originally should have had with Abram. Anyway, questions or comments? Okay. If there's no questions or comments, let's pray. Let's have communion and then praise. Offering, praise, and then benediction.